10 things that I wish I had learned earlier. Some of this I learned the hard way, some of it came from other people making mistakes and then sharing it with me or with others online, and I figured pay it forward a little bit and see what we can get out there. One of the biggest ones I've always wanted to cover time and time again, and did on my very first video, was the importance of acid, tannin, sugar balancing. That is the first thing that a lot of new mead makers miss. And what you can do to make your batch really come to another level is making sure after you've fermented that the bitterness, the sweetness, and the sourness are all in line with one another. Chef, do you have any tips or tricks for acid tannin balance?
I mean, my big thing is bench trials, right? You've got a video that you did on doing sort of lazy bench trial, right? Which is where you sit there with a bottle of bitters and you take a sample and you put a couple drops in and you taste it and you see, is the mead improved, right? And then you take a little squeeze of lemon juice and you see if the mead is improved. And then, I think that's a great starting place to say, is there, acid or tannin balancing that I could be doing that would make my mead better? But I'm, of course, a big fan of, more systematic approaches.
Yes.
Right? Where you take, where you make, stock solutions that are of a known concentration of tannin, and you take known volumes of samples of your mead, and you add known volumes of that known, concentration sample solution to 3, 4, 5 different samples of mead at different concentrations, and then you go through them and you pick the one, like, I like this one best and I like this one best, right? I think these two, I can't decide between them, and so maybe you blend them, right? And you try that one and see if the sweet spot is somewhere in between them, right? And so once you've done that, and right, and I like to go in a specific order. I like to balance my tannins, and then I like to balance my sweetness, and then I like to balance my acids. And at each stage, I'm doing a bench trial. Now, the problem that a lot of people are making is most people make 1 gallon batches, right? I would say that's, the vast majority of mead makers are probably making 1 gallon batches. And, like when you start doing these bench trials, it starts consuming a lot of your product, right? There's sort of, 2 ways you can go about, dealing with that. Is you can make, let's say you're going for a 1 gallon carboy, well, you make enough to have, maybe a couple bottles, right? So when you're racking out of your fermenter, you rack 1 gallon into your carboy, and then you fill a couple bottles, cap them, cork them, whatever, set them aside, right? And so then, from your main batch, you do your bench trials, right? And then you can fill the headspace in with that extra mead that you send back, right?
Okay.
And so that, it's imperfect, right? And that's part of the reason why I quickly go from 1 gallon test batch into I do a big monster, 5-6 gallon batches, so I don't feel bad about taking 715 milliliters and using that for bench trials to really dial in the acid, tannin, sweetness balance.
Particularly if you're trying to do this as a new brewer, you've got a hydrometer and you're trying to go figure out what the specific gravity of all these different things. I mean, you put the honey in, but are you sure you got it all, well mixed in, all the other issues? We've got these easy dense densometers that are just, they totally trivialize that because you just need a very small sample, just a few milliliters of it. But have you ever tried using a refractometer to do your specific gravity of a blend? Because that's a whole mess on its other side.
And it would be, right? And that's also part of the reason why, for most brewers who aren't going to drop $400 on an easy dense, right? That's why it's important to have a, process that, and I wrote about this on the mead subreddit wiki, and we can put a link into the description of wherever this video winds up being that walks through my process for doing bench trials, right? And so, I also do the same thing with, back sweetening, is I make a honey water solution of a fairly known concentration. You do your trials and you scale it from there. And, that's not going to be quite as accurate, right? Because you're not going to have enough to pour into your graduated cylinder and drop your hydrometer in, but it'll get you pretty close.
I would love to do a part 2 video for the acid, tannin, sugar balance that I've gone and done, and then to go sit down with all the different, very, very fine solutions to be able to go through the whole thing for like one traditional mead, the whole process, sweetening everything with some of the fancy tools and some without, and you're just pipetting little bits into known samples and really talk through the whole process at a very fine level like that. Number 2 on the list for me was nutrient uses and how to recognize them. Most of us at this point like using nutrient, but when do you use which nutrient? What are the good ones? What are the bad ones? And how do you tell them apart? Good and bad is really subjective, so we're not going to get into that too much. But how to tell them apart? Brown powders, those are organics. White chunks or crystals, or maybe if they're really finely ground, a powder. I've seen a couple. Those are inorganics and are mostly DAP, urea, and other derivatives like that. So Fermento being the main organic that we're familiar with. What other ones? I mean, Go Firm obviously, but Anchor Firm.
I mean, there's
so many.
An artist makes one.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2 or 3 different wine companies that make both, or yeast/nutrient companies that make their own organic formulations, that make their own organic and inorganic formulations. I know that there's actually a new one on the market. You may recall Corey was trying to get together a group buy for that one that's specifically targeted at what are called low nutrient bases, right?
Seltzers.
Right. So like mead is a low nutrient. Low nutrient base, right? Mead is a low nutrient base in the parlance of the scientists at the wine companies that do research on this stuff. And it's something that I'm really excited to sort of give a try because, and that's one of the great things about the seltzer boom.
Yeah, helps us find some things.
It helps us find some things, is that there's so much stuff, so much information, the assumptions about, nutrient loads and what nutrients do are all predicated on wines and having things that are commonly come from wine grapes, right? And so they may not behave exactly like we expect them to in, say, like a traditional mead, right? Fermentation pans, for example, are a big one that would probably behave very differently in a traditional mead than they would something made with fruit or grapes or something like that. I was corresponding with a scientist at Scott Laboratories recently, and she told me that they recently started doing a lot of work in the no nutrient basis field, and what she was telling me is that they've been finding that some of the conventional wisdom that we've had in the mead making worlds for years, right, which is the standard pitch rate for yeast is 1 gram per gallon.
Is it? Or you always do 2?
Standard recommended for wine.
Oh, okay.
Right. Standard recommended for wine is 1 gram per gallon, and the conventional wisdom in the mead community is that you should really do a slightly bigger one, 2 grams per gallon, right? Sometimes I do up to 5 grams per gallon in particularly challenging ferments.
Cranberry.
Yeah, cranberry, for example, right? And what she told me was that they were finding that, and it's not that they heard that and then they tried it, is that, they did their experiments and they found out that for these no nutrient bases, they were getting better outcomes with higher pitch rates. Right? Which I think is pretty cool, right? Citizen scientists in the mead community, discovered something, before the professional ones at Scott Labs, given, with the proviso that, we've been working on it for years, collectively as a community, and they just recently started the last year or 2, right, just because of the seltzer boom.
Well, seeing all the stuff that they're starting to put out for both mead, seltzer, and some of the other more organically sourced fermentation, that's, who wants to go make, some rice wine, sake? That'd be awesome to be able to have some good textbook information to go reference on that, and not just be shooting in the dark with various forum posts. So the one other thing I wanted to cover, you use Go Firm, Fermento, Ferment K, and DAP, all in a big old blend.
Yeah, and it really depends, right, on how lazy I am, right? So I was doing a BP, a lemon mead. I couldn't find my Fermento, and I couldn't find my DAP, so I just did the whole thing with K, right? Hashtag I'm lazy. Hashtag I don't keep good notes anymore. I really need to change that.
Yeah.
I also use a couple other nutrients that are, again, of the variety that you have to buy them by the kilogram. They're called Stimula Syrah, Stimula Chardonnay, Stimula Sauvignon Blanc, and Stimula...
I don't remember, but they all do more or less the same thing. They're increasing the aromatic expression.
Yeah, I mean, like each of them serves a slightly different purpose, right? They each have different minerals and vitamins and things like that they express that support different parts of the yeast metabolism. And I've got it written down and actually decoding where I categorize them, and I never remember it off the top of my head, but one of them increases floral expression, one of them increases fruit expression, and they're more or less replacements for fermento, right? So when I'm calculating nutrition using those, I'll calculate my newts, and then there are a couple of them that are best added at the beginning of alcoholic fermentation. There are a couple of them that are best added at the 1/3 sugar break, right? You just replace whatever addition you were going to do with fermento with an equal amount of those.
So, single source nutrient, if I had to pick it, ferment K, 100%. No questions in my mind about that at all for mead. Ferment A, ferment E for our friends abroad, same as that. Effectively, just slightly different formulations for legal reasons. And then Go Firm is just such a game changer for fermentation security. But to hit back on the point, white crystals, diammonium phosphate, inorganics, use them when you're under 9% ABV, or before you've gone and hit 9% ABV. You probably want them for hitting some of the upper limits, 15, 18, 19% ABV. You're probably going to need a little bit of inorganic to do some heavy lifting. And then your organic sources, ferment O, and then the blend of the two is K and its other cohorts. And they're a very good multivitamin and organic and inorganic happy marriage.
Yeah, and there are ferment K alternatives on the market. Right?
Yeah, Fermax.
There's LD Carlson's yeast energizer.
Why
yeast has her thing.
So item number 3, headspace and buckets. Buckets and primary. We believe in buckets. Bucket gang. I think there's even an expression for it.
Hashtag bucket gang. Yeah. And this is another thing that I always see beginning homebrewers doing, which is fermenting in carboys. Right. Like we were talking about before, I sort of came into this hobby not making a lot of these sort of like missteps. I stood on the shoulders of giants and managed to find the right resources before I started brewing. But you'll see people fermenting in carboys, which they're making their gallon batch and they're fermenting in a 1 gallon carboy. And so what's going to happen after they're done with that? They're going to rack it into a second carboy. They're going to rack it into the second carboy. They're going to have a lot of headspace, right? And then they take a picture of it and they post it on Reddit saying, "Do I have too much headspace?" Right? But dealing with headspace is always a matter of planning, right? What are you intending to age it in? Well, I'm intending to age it in a 1 gallon carboy. Well, then you should get a bucket and you should make a 1.2, 1.3 gallon batch, so that you can fill up your secondary container completely. A 1 gallon carboy holds more than 1 gallon.
Yep.
And then going back to earlier bench trials, might as well bump that up to 1.5, 1.6 gallons, so you have some to top up with.
You can manage your fruit. You can mix and aerate well, which we might talk about later. You've got access to everything. You don't need to worry really about molding. People think, headspace bad, but during the heavy fermentation, you're not going to have any oxidative issues. In mead, don't at me, beer folks. You know what you're doing better with beer than I do, I promise. Maybe a compromise is one of those like big mouth bubblers, those nice big plastic ones with the sealing tops that come off. There are good options, especially if you're scared about leaky buckets, that make all that work, and you can still get power tools down the neck.
There's a few, right? So there's the Speedles, right?
Speedles, right? That's what I have.
You've got 16 gallon Speedles. I've got a little cute 5.4 gallon Speedle. It seals excellently. It's got a nice big wide mouth, so you can get fruit in, fruit out. Very
got a whole chiller rig that goes in the top of one of them.
Vermonster is another one that has a fairly wide mouth that also seals very well.
And conical ones too.
Yeah.
I don't know for months, but I know there's a couple of other ones out there that, big plastic thing, conical bottom, if that's your flavor. I'm not big on them, but some people.
Some people like them.
Yeah.
Your people like them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you manage your headspace. You have a good bit in primary. How much do you do extra? I usually do about 20% extra volume, unless I try to fly too close to the sun.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
It also really depends on the batch size, right? So if you're like making, 15-gallon batch, you don't need 20% overage.
I thought I was okay with 2 gallons extra on the last mango puree that I did, and I paid the iron price on that one.
Well, that's also, yeah. It's really, the fermenters are a function of how much money do you want to throw at the problem.
Yeah.
So, if you go to your bakery, you buy it, and you get them to give you a 3-gallon bucket for free, it might not seal well. You probably want to rack out a primary pretty quickly, right? At home, I've got a maple wine sitting in my, Speedle that's sealed up pretty good. The airlock's full. It finished primary a month ago, and I haven't racked it yet. And I'm confident doing that because the Speedle seals well, and I know that headspace is purged with CO2.
I've done hydromels in the Speedle with significant headspace and never had an issue with it. Really love those big grommets. It's a 18-inch O-ring on the top of it. It's huge for the 60 liters.
So step one is don't have the problem, right? 7 P's: prior proper preparation, prevents piss poor performance, and I guess oxidation. The second thing to do is, if you have headspace, if you've been racking it, and I think we're talking about racking a little bit later, and you think you've oxidized it, or if you've racked it at all, you've added oxygen to it. And so there are preventative measures that you take, and you know that I am a big proponent of managing your free SO2 levels.
I'm interrupting right now. The thing that I'm tasting in this that I'm not in mine is vanilla, which is, I'm assuming, from the oak, but I'm getting a much stronger vanilla character in it, and I'm embarrassed that it took me this long in order to identify what I was tasting in it. So, sorry about that segue.
Yeah.
Good on headspace buckets?
Yeah, managing your free SO2 levels,
Yeah,
right?
free SO2, yeah.
When you rack out a primary, right? So, while you're in primary, while you're in an active ferment, you don't really need to worry about oxidation, because any healthy yeast ferment is going to scavenge oxygen very well while it's still actively fermenting, right? Once you've finished with your fermentation, then you need to start worrying about your oxygen ingress, right? So whenever I rack out a primary, I add some potassium metabisulfite. Right? I add specifically 50 parts per billion. Every time I rack after that, I add 25 parts per billion. Before I bottom, I usually add another 25 parts per billion. So you don't want to go hog wild, racking it, but using K-meta in that way, and continuing to add it, right? Because it binds to oxygen that gets introduced, and then the levels go down, and so you want to keep replenishing it, right? So my barrel project right now, the free SO2 levels drop. I have to measure them once every 2 or 3 weeks. I have to add additional K-meta. And most home brewers can't measure K-meta, which is why I gave that sort of rule of thumb. Measure free SO2, which is why I gave the rule of thumb. But managing your free SO2 and making sure you're keeping up with additions is a great way to combat headspace. In my opinion.
I wish I had that Benmetrica, but
Just one piece of gear.
I got a couple other pieces of gear that I got to get before I get into one of those. The Easy Dense was a big boy for me, for sure. Seeds, spices, and adjuncts to avoid. So this is kind of a big conglomerate of ones, like, easy mistakes to make with things that you're adding to the mead for flavor. Strawberry pips. Those are one of my least favorite ones to go and taste. What's the flavor on that? It's Band-Aids. Yeah. And it's just like this awful thing. It doesn't age out. It's never better. It does decrease a little bit, but at the end of the day, it still tastes kind of like this rubbery Band-Aid flavor. And so what you want to do is you want to put them in and get them out. Like 1 week contact time, it's going to be okay. You're going to get all your strawberries. You get some Lalzine EXV in there to dissolve them, and then just go into a goo instantly with some mechanical maceration. You will get the flavor quickly. Spices, it's easy to overdo spices. The number one iconic one for it is cloves. You put in too many cloves, and you will have something that is good for when you have your wisdom teeth extracted that you don't taste or feel anything anymore. Don't overdo the cloves. And other parts of the adjunct to avoid. So citrus pith, you generally want to avoid unless you're using it as a bittering agent. Recipes like Joe's Ancient use it specifically for bittering, and it's great in there. It's very easy to add too much, and especially if you're trying to add a bunch of orange, say, to get an orange flavor, to not have used enough zest and juice and added so much pith that it's unpleasant before you got all the orange flavor that you wanted. Same for grapefruit zest. Interestingly enough, I learned that one personally the hard way. Other things you can overdo: hops, peppers, oak is a really easy one to overdo. You just say, "Oh, this looks about right." Oh, did I do that on that? Oh, yeah. And you just throw in a handful, and then you come back after not tasting it, 6 weeks later, and you realize that the only thing you can taste is like bark. And especially if it's a heavier toast or something like that, you can just totally ruin things.
Yeah, and I think the big takeaway from it, especially spices and oak, and to some extent fruit, right, is tasting your mead, as you're spicing it and pulling the oak or racking off the oak or pulling the spices when the level gets appropriate, right? Unless you've done a batch, a couple times and got the same results with the same amount, just eating it in there, not caring about it for a couple months, taste it occasionally, and if the flavor starts to get too much, pull it out. Right.
Point is to make something tasty, so you may as well use your tongue to be your guide.
And then if you do overdo it, right, time can heal some of that wound, right?
Reuse.
So oak will round off and diminish with time. The stringency will go down with time. Spice character will tend to go down with time over a sufficient time scale. It's time can fix a lot of sins.
Let's see. The rest of it doesn't need to be covered too much. Value of simplicity and the value of blending. So, since we're talking about mead comps, one of the big things in mead competitions is if you go and say what's in it, you got to be able to taste it in a mead competition, or you'll get docked points. Also, for simplicity, sometimes it's easier to make a simple batch than it is to make something that has like 40 adjuncts, because if you overdo one, all these other ones are just either wasted or worse, it's too tannic, too tart, too muddled. You can't taste the strawberry because the cranberry just says, "Oh, here's the cranberry."
Well, but even beyond that, even if you don't have a particular spice that is too dominant, right? You can also it gets muddled, right? Like you can't, identify individual.
What is this? It's tea.
Yeah,
great.
You can't identify the individual flavors, and it can be busy, right? Now, that's not to say, right, that you can't make something absolutely delicious that has 15 different herbs and spices in it, right? But the person who's made that recipe is going to have tested it. They're going to have an experienced palate. They're going to have some idea of these things go together, right? And it's possible to make a harmonious mead with 15 different spices, right? I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But, you have to experiment to find that point, right? And I think that's a fallacy that a lot of new brewers make as they come into the hobby, and you'll see people coming in and just saying, "Man, I want to make this mead. It's got 10 different spices in it." I'm just like, slow your roll, man, right? Do a single factor at a time when you're learning and training your palate. Make a batch that has cinnamon, make a batch that has clove, make a batch that has cardamom, and then blend them and figuring out what the balance is that you want. And then when you make your next batch, you can proportionally add your spices such that you can do the 10 or 15 different spices in a single batch.
I always have blending stocks on hand. I have a sour mead, I have a sweet mead, and I have a neutral with light oak mead. I used to have some neutral heavy oaks, but I ended up drinking all of those because they were delicious. And then if I had something that was like, okay, this just misses the mark a little bit. Okay, what happens if it's a little bit sweeter? What happens if it's a little bit more acidic? You go blend it like 1 to 2 with some other mead that you wonder, okay, could it be a little different here? And you can really blend some stuff together from some very simple adjuncts and meads that are much stronger than the individual sum of the parts. What do we got next? Primary versus secondary fruit. One of the things that I wish I had started on earlier is understanding the difference between primary and secondary and what it's good for. You hear a lot of people say that if you put fruit in primary, it goes out the airlock. I am drinking a Sizer that tastes very strongly of cider, and it was all in the beginning, and that's because it was all cider in the beginning. The more fruit you can put in, the stronger fruit flavor you're going to get. It is a different flavor though, in the beginning or in the end. So if you have it in the beginning, you get more of the fermented, wine-like Manus flavors. Or if you put it in the end, like let's say you go do a black currant, at 2 pounds per gallon at the end of a ferment, you're going to get a very strong sangria flavor then. And it's, these different tools that you have to add different things. Different tools to be used at different times. And then the more fruit you add is the bigger thing for how much fruit flavor you have, being the long and short of it.
Well, and really, this is something that I really want to do. But I think anybody who's making melomels, I think this would be a very useful exercise. Would be to do an experiment, right? You make 3 different meads. One mead, you put all your fruit in primary.
Say 4 pounds.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. One mead, you put all your fruit in secondary. The third mead, you put half the fruit in primary, you put half the fruit in secondary. Right. And so I think that'd be educational for just about anyone to do, to sort of like get an idea of what the difference is, what people say when they say a Venus fermented flavor from your fruit versus a fresh one, and sort of see what the blend of the two does. And I've seen that exercise recommended. There's a guy named Ryan Carlson who participates a lot in GOTME forums, who really believes in that, and that everybody should do it. It's on my list.
Yeah, add it to that long damn list.
As long as my arm.
Effective micron sizing, oxidative damage, and racking best practice. Or, in long and short, how to ruin your mead as fast as possible. So racking into secondary or bulk age or tertiary or anything like that, the easiest way you can screw up your mead is getting a whole buttload of oxygen in there and not doing anything about it. So how do you rack from primary?
Lately I've started using a pump.
Yeah.
I find it's very convenient. I've started using kegs for secondary almost exclusively. I'm getting a little bit tired of carting around glass and worrying about dropping it and going to the hospital. But most people are going to be using an auto siphon.
Yeah.
Right. And so things that you want to keep in mind with your auto siphon is you should just take 1 or 2 pumps, right, to get that thing going. Right, we were racking something at your place the other day, and we were having to right, and that happens as your seals get worse, and if you're having to go,
you got to replace the rubber somewhere,
right? That can cause problems. Another common problem is you have your hose that doesn't seal well, right? So if you're washing your mead rack through that hose and you're seeing a little stream of bubbles that are going down the side, right? That's probably a sign that the hose hasn't sealed well to the auto siphon.
It can just be carbonation, but you look for where it's coming from. It'll be coming from right around the sides and be obviously drawing in a little bit of bubbles from wherever the seal is bad, and you need to fix that either with like a hose clamp or a fresh piece of hose or something, because that is doing a large amount of harm to your mead.
Yeah, but ultimately, I personally, even when I'm not using the pump, I'm done with auto siphons. They break too often. I just find it a lot more convenient to suck start my siphons, right? So you put the racking cane in the source, and you get yourself a little mouthful of mead. You put your thumb on the end. You can spritz it with star sand if you want. Then you put it into the destination, right? And I find that's a lot more convenient. You get a sample.
Probably should stabilize your mead after that, though.
You're not sucking in the mouth, right? I mean, that's why you spritz it with the sanitizer. If you're paranoid, wash your mouth out with vodka or something like that beforehand.
And I'm still pretty big on the auto siphon train. I did get a very nice stainless auto siphon that has very easy to service O-rings and stuff. It makes it so that I can keep it in really good shape, and it's very large, so it does siphon very quickly in my large containers. I still wish I had spent the money on a pump. A good pump is only like $150.
And you can get perfectly serviceable ones for less than that, right?
Yeah.
So, Northern Brewer has a self-priming pump for like $60. It's one of the ones that I use. It works fine. The only real criticism that I have is that it's a bit faster than I like.
Mm-hmm.
I would like it if it were,
Dial
adjustable
back, yeah.
speed. But those are the ones that cost $150, right?
And, if you go through, 3 auto siphons? How many auto siphons have you bought? At least 6. You leave them in, star sand once, and they're brittle, and they get those little cracks all over the place, and they're never the same again. A pump that, you could just buy once, cry once. I'm a big fan of that in brewing, and that's one of the things I wish I had learned. Added to the 10 things I wish I knew. I wish I just bought a pump rather than all the frickin' racking canes I had.
Yeah, and the racking cane always breaks when you're trying to use it to rack your thing, and then you're like, oh, crap, it's 7 o'clock.
Granted, racking cane, racking wand, or bottling wand is the combo, unless you've got positive pressure racking from a keg for bottling. It can't use a pump for bottling. Maybe use a bottling bucket then instead. Gravity, do your thing, get one less rack out of it. There are solutions around it. Totally missed the Micron sizing. Coffee filters don't work. You're not getting yeast out of there. You're not getting yeast out with a brew bag or anything else. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be getting stuff to percolate through that brewing bag or coffee filter or whatever, and you're just going to oxidize your mead. You can go add SO2 to, combat that, but if you're not doing something useful with it, just don't. If you have got your fruit in a brew bag, great. It's going to reduce some of your solids in your final product. If you're doing 3 pounds per gallon, it's great. You lift it up, it drains out, you toss your fruit. We've all done it. It's awesome. It works very well, but it's for gross solids, things that you can see, with applicable size to your thumb.
I mean, ultimately, the finest brew bags that you're going to see, and I think that this is probably coffee filters as well, are going to run into the 100 to 200 micron rating size, right? The largest wine filter, so the micron rating is, if it's 100 microns, then it blocks most particles 100 microns or more, unless it's an absolute filter. The largest wine filter that you'll see that is used in a wine is going to be 10 microns. And that's probably...
pre-filters too, but
yes.
Whatever.
10 microns is where you're going to start seeing appreciable clearing.
Yes, absolutely.
While filtering. And gravity filtering with any filter 10 microns or less may work. It'll take a long time. You're ultimately going to be pumping or using positive pressure to drive it through.
And I have a positive pressure triple stage filter where I go run either 10.5, 0.5, or I've run anything from 30 to 0.5 and a whole different variety of combinations. And a 0.35, absolute filter, it's $100, but it makes some very clear mead when it comes out of it. And I don't think it damages the aromatics much. And by much, I mean, I think that you do naturally get reductions in aromatics over time just due to oxygen. And, if you have a little bit of a longer aging time, you're going to naturally see that reduction anyhow. Let's see, bentonite, enzymes, and fining.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that one for me?
Well, so I think real quick, Kyle has a question in chat about racking no water meats, and I think this is a little bit related. So basically the question is, how do you handle racking no water meats? The short answer to that question is it sucks. Basically when you're making a no water meat, you can expect to get 40 to 60% losses, and you're just going to have to deal with that. Now there are things that you can do to make it a little bit easier. I have a 300 micron sleeve for an autosiphon that does a pretty decent job of, you just stick it down in there. It does a pretty decent job of getting you a decent amount of free run. I don't like it a huge amount. I wouldn't buy it again, simply because it is very small, and so there's very little surface area. So I find that it gets clogged really easily. I'm having to wipe it down, very frequently to sort of keep fluid going into it. Another thing that a lot of people do is they use a hop spider, right? So one of those things that's about, yay big around that you would put into a beer boil, throw your hops in there. You shove that down into the mead and you rack out from the middle of that. Storm here has a fruit press that he will shove down into the mead, and we actually used that this past weekend to rack off that blueberry hydromel, and that also does a pretty good job. But ultimately, you just have to accept big losses.
I mean, I'd get as low as maybe 20% if I'm being aggressive with it, but I think it's not uncommon to see anywhere between 30 and 50 if you're not getting terribly aggressive with it.
Now, I think Corey has done some work using false bottoms.
Yeah.
In which, maybe next time I do a big fruit batch, I'll ferment it in the anvil, with all the fruit in the grain basket, and then try to do free run off of that. But yeah, big fruit sucks. The meat's amazing, but they're expensive because you lose a lot.
What else we forgot? Bentonite, enzyme. Oh yeah, okay. So answer the question from the. Yeah. And so bentonite and enzymes. When do you put those in?
So I've long been a champion of using bentonite in primary. I know that I brought a lot of people to Jesus on that. I know I brought you to Jesus on bentonite in primary. It's, I think, the single greatest fining agent that we have at our disposal. So, using it in primary, in most meats, I believe that the most common cause of haze is protein haze. And, proteins in bentonite, bentonite is an excellent finder of proteins. It binds to proteins early, and it helps to preserve tannins, the naturally occurring tannins that come from whatever ingredients that you're using, be it fruit or even the honey, from binding to those proteins and falling out of solution. Bentonite tends to work better in primary because it works best when it's roused repeatedly back into suspension, which fermentation kinetics do a great job of doing. So basically, the bentonite rises up, it grabs a few things, it falls back down. A little bubble of CO2 will nucleate on it and bring it back up, and it'll grab a couple more things and fall back down. I find that I get meats out of primary almost more often than not that I can read through, right? That
30 days in, it's like, oh, yeah, well that worked. It's very effective, highly effective. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that with enzymes, right? Enzymes are very important for clearing fruited meats because they denature the pectins or something like that. It's just science stuff, right? But enzymes themselves are proteins, right? So you want to be very careful about using bentonite with enzymes because as soon as you add the bentonite, it's going to start binding to all of your enzymes and activating them and dropping them out of solution, which in some cases is desirable, right? So there are certain enzymes where you might want to cut off their activity. I can't speak to those because I know they exist, but I haven't done a lot of research. I haven't used them, but I know those exist. So typically when you're using bentonite primary, if you're not using
Enzymes, I put it in at pitch. If I am using enzymes, I'll usually toss it in with 1/3 break.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there's still plenty of active fermentation activity going on at that point, and you've given the enzymes a couple days to do their work.
Mm-hmm. All right, next big one, CO2 layering. This is with big old air quotations on it. One of the big myths with CO2 is that it forms a blanket on top of your mead and preserves it. It would be very nice if that was the case. It does initially when it's being created, if it's coming up from bubbling, it'll be densest at the bottom for sure, since it's a dense gas compared to our atmosphere. But if you're like adding in CO2 from a tank or nitrogen from a tank, which could be very much the same density, you have to fill the whole headspace and purge every piece of oxygen from there in order to get the effects that you're looking for. And one thing with CO2, if you go fill the bucket, and then put your nose close to the top of it and taking a big whiff, if you don't immediately start choking and gagging, it's not full. It's not done, and it actually takes a lot more than you would expect to go put into there. I do a lot of CO2 purges. I'll go run a keg, with connected straight to my CO2 tank, purge it on all through, pull the purge valve, jettison the atmosphere out, do that 2-3 times, and I never have issues with it. I definitely have had issues on a leaky bucket where I go squirt some CO2 into there and then come back 2 months later and cardboard.
Yeah.
Fucked up here.
So, of note, I didn't bring my power adapter. We're about to run out of juice.
Okay. How much time do you think you got? 10 minutes?
It says 10 minutes. 8 minutes now.
8 minutes. All right. Let's do this real fast then. CO2 layering drill stirs. Okay, drill stirs. Where do you get them? Homebrew shops and Amazon and whatever you feel like. Paint mixers. Fantastic. You go get a big old drill for them, and they do a great job for macerating fruit. You may need to get a bigger, more powerful drill for bigger batches, but small stuff, absolutely you can use some nice small drills for all of that.
Yeah. They're also purpose-built drill stirs for winemaking. The one that I have is called a leaf stir or a mix stir, and it has 2 plastic blades on the bottom that fit through the neck of a carboy. Then when you start stirring, they flip out like that, so you get a very effective stirring. It's one of the most useful tools that I own. I'm a big fan of it. There are also other wine degassing things. So there's another one that I have that's got 3 prongs that come off the end of it.
Yeah.
I find that that's fantastic for back sweetening. It does a great job of getting into the nooks and crannies of the carboy.
Just use that.
You might have just used that.
Yeah. Borrowed that.
So yeah, no, I mean, definitely get a drill stir. It's great for aerating your must. It's great for stirring ingredients in. It's great for mechanically macerating fruit to break it up.
Bonus points. This is number 11, but the polycarbonate hydrometers. I have broken hydrometers. I wish I was more careful that I brewed while sober, which I don't. And I was, good about putting them down in places where they belong. Sometimes you set a keg down on one, sometimes you drop one, sometimes you do all kinds of unspeakable things to them. If you have a polycarbonate one, it does not shatter.
I've literally thrown them across the room overhand, and they're still accurate, and they're great. I know Midwest Supply / Northern Brewer sells one. There are other ones that are starting to come on the market, but that's a big thing that I can recommend. So that way, you don't have to be part of the rite of passage that becomes, oh my gosh, you're posting Reddit. Oh, I broke my hydrometer.
Heaven forbid it's in a batch.
Oh God, heaven forbid it's in a batch. Yeah.
That's when you may need to get that coffee filter.
So yeah.
Yeah, so those are the 10 points that I wanted to cover.
Okay. So, yeah, we're going to